Hey everyone, to wrap up our discussion of Unit 8 on aquatic and terrestrial pollution, I'd like to spend some time talking about how pollution can exacerbate diseases and impact human health. Specifically, what diseases are most prominently affected by pollution and what we can do to combat them. So first of all, it's important to establish that linking the cause of a disease to the actual disease itself can be very difficult because there are so many possible different chemicals, pollutants, and toxins that we're exposed to on a regular basis. It's hard to say for sure, hey, this one product or chemical is the link to this specific disease. Think about everything that's around you. How could you possibly isolate the impact of one specific pollutant? And if you think back to some of the projects we've done in class, some of the experiments, you may remember how tricky it can be to isolate one independent variable without having any confounding factors. That being said, there are a few diseases that we're aware of that we can link to a specific cause. Cancers, for example, although they come from a variety of causes, can be exacerbated by different types of pollution, most notably heavy metals, which are carcinogens, cancer-causing agents. But there are also some mutagens and teratogens as well, which can mutate cellular DNA or DNA in the fetus. Untreated or raw sewage can lead to the growth of a bacterial disease known as dysentery. Exposure to asbestos can lead to a type of cancer called mesothelioma, which we've mentioned before. And exposure to ground level or tropospheric ozone can lead to a variety of respiratory illnesses. These are all things that we've mentioned before, and they are on the unusual case where we can say, hey, asbestos specifically causes mesothelioma. We know that for a fact, as opposed to some of these other diseases that it's a little bit harder to nail things down. These are diseases that are directly caused by pollution, but pollution can also indirectly cause disease because they facilitate the spread from person to person or from organism to organism. And they do that through the actual pathogen itself. The pathogen is just an organism that causes the disease. It could be a worm, a fungus, a virus, a prion, a bacteria, you name it. And these usually have pretty short life cycles, so they can evolve very quickly and they can spread quickly, which is why you need to get a new flu vaccine, a flu shot every year, because the influenza, the avian flu, evolves resistance to the vaccine every year. But these pathogens oftentimes thrive in areas, populations, and communities that don't have good sanitation, right? A great example of this is medieval Europe during the Black Death in the 1300s. The bubonic plague spread very rapidly because people were dumping their sewage in the streets. They didn't have soap. They didn't know about washing your hands, touching your face, all that stuff. And drinking water was contaminated. So that really allowed the pathogen to spread quickly. Now, we still see those sorts of patterns today in low-income areas, areas of the globe that don't have access to technologies that allow for wastewater treatment or cleaning drinking water. But generally speaking, many pathogens can occur anywhere, although they tend to find an easier time developing in areas that have lower sanitation and higher pollution. So here's some notable infectious diseases that pollution can facilitate the spread of. I just talked about bubonic plague. Tuberculosis is a bacterial respiratory infection. West Nile virus and Triple E virus are both caused by or spread by mosquitoes. SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome, and MERS, which is Middle East respiratory syndrome, transferred from animals to humans and can have significant impacts on your lungs. Zika virus, also transmitted by mosquitoes, but not really in our area so much as tropical areas. That had a pretty big outbreak a couple years ago and has the unique characteristic where it can be passed from a pregnant mother to its child. Cholera is a bacteria that can commonly infect water, and Ebola is a disease that you may be familiar with. There was an outbreak in 2013 in the Congo, I believe. Yes, the Congo. And that actually spread to the U.S. just a little bit, but the U.S. did a good job containing things. There are a few diseases that I want to talk a little bit more about. Malaria, which is a protist, comes from, it's a pathogen that is carried by mosquitoes. Now, mosquitoes themselves don't cause malaria, but they do carry it and can spread it from human to human or animal to animal. And so they are what we call a vector. A mosquito is a vector, meaning that they carry the disease. You get the disease if you get bitten by a mosquito and it injects blood into you that has the malaria virus, or if you come into contact with contaminated fluids. Interesting fact, sickle cell anemia, which is a genetic disorder in which the red blood cells are misshapen, can actually lead to immunity to malaria. So we see high levels of sickle cell anemia in areas where there are high levels of malaria, and those coincide with areas where mosquitoes can survive, which is mostly tropical and subtropical regions near the equator, which is why many of the malaria cases are in Africa, because not only is there a tropical region there, but there's also, generally speaking, less funding and research and less developed healthcare. Malaria is currently the deadliest disease in the world, killing between 250 to 500 million people per year, although cases have been decreasing due to medicine, use of pesticides like DDT, and draining wetlands to reduce mosquito breeding grounds. The issue is, though, if you're going to use DDT and you're going to drain wetlands, you've got to consider that you're doing damage to the environment by using pesticides and draining the wetlands, even if you are helping save human lives. So there's a drawback, and much like any decision when it comes to environmental science, you've got to weigh the pros and cons of each situation. Another disease I want to spend a significant chunk of time talking about is HIV or AIDS. HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus infection, and that is the virus that infects a human, and it can lead to the development of AIDS, which stands for acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It was formerly known as the gay-related immune deficiency, because initially, as this disease started spreading into more widespread in the populations, it was initially found in members of the gay community. And so there was a very significant social stigma against gay people, and that this disease was a disease that gay people got. This can lead to death because it weakens your immune system, which makes you likely to get other diseases such as cancer that can ultimately kill you. And it can be transmitted sexually. It can be transmitted by contact with body fluids, and much like the Zika virus, it can be transmitted from a mother to its infant or to its embryo if the mother is pregnant. Now, back to that social stigma I was mentioning before, HIV can be transmitted through body fluids. So it was significant in populations of drug users who were sharing needles, and it can also be sexually transmitted. To this day, the number one cause of HIV transmission is heterosexual contact, right? Sex between a man and a woman. But early on in HIV's growth in the United States and around the world, it gained a reputation as being something that only gay people got, because that's where it was first located. It was in the gay community. And so at that time, the gay community wasn't even as nearly as accepted openly as it is today. So there were multiple reasons, whether you were gay, whether you had HIV, or if you had both, like Freddie Mercury here, many, many reasons why you might not want to come forward and say so and get treatment, because you could be a social outcast. This is Ryan White. Ryan White was not gay. He did have HIV, and he got it from a blood transfusion because he was a hemophiliac. And when he was diagnosed with HIV, his local community was so scared of contracting the disease, even though you can only contract it through these methods, that they actually expelled him from his high school. And unfortunately, he never returned to the high school, and he died just a few days before his high school graduation. So the social stigma against HIV was extremely, extremely prejudiced. And furthermore, we see that exacerbated that social stigma even more so within the Black community in the United States. Currently, about 1 million people in the US are infected with HIV. Half of those people are Black. That's not coincidence. That's due to the fact of a systematic and historical oppression of the Black community. America's only 13% Black, so why are half of the HIV victims Black? A lot of it has to do with the war on drugs in the 1980s and decisions made by the Reagan administration. If you want more information on specifically HIV and the Black community, I highly recommend you check out PBS's Frontline documentary called Endgame. AIDS in Black America is extremely enlightening and well worth the watch. Luckily, there's a lot we can do to combat AIDS. First of all, there's a treatment called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. You may have seen commercials for it, like Truvada. You could take this medication daily to prevent contraction of HIV if you are in a high-risk population. If you're a drug user, if you had sex with someone unprotected and you think they may have HIV, this is a type of drug that you can take to help prevent contracting the disease. Currently, there is no cure, although very recently there have been some developments on that front, curing AIDS and HIV. So things are looking up. Generally speaking, in terms of Africa, where the problem is very widespread, President Bush began with an abstinence-only education, basically telling people in Africa, don't have sex, don't spread the disease. But there are other ways to get the disease, and that's not really a realistic option. What the people really needed is maybe condoms and medication. Bono, who's the lead singer of U2, started Project Red, which is a charity that raised money selling special products that are branded with this logo, Buy Red, Save Lives, and the proceeds go towards HIV research and treatment in Africa. Apple does a lot of work with this. You may have recognized some of your favorite games were raising money for Project Red, but you can also get Beats, iPhone cases, luggage, tote bags, dog collars, condoms, bracelets, all sorts of stuff. Okay, so that's a little bit about HIV AIDS. I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. I just want to talk about it a little bit. Pollution, we were generally speaking talking about how pollution can exacerbate disease, but it's not just pollution, it's also climate change. I hope you realize that as the world warms, the biomes and the climate that we are used to are going to start to shift. Equatorial biomes are going to start spreading towards the north and towards the south into temperate regions as those regions start to warm up. And with them, diseases will follow. The pathogens, the infectious diseases, and the vectors themselves, mosquitoes, birds, and rats, are now going to be able to live in places that they didn't normally live in because the temperature range is changing. Here's an example. These colors represent zones of plant hardiness, but you can basically take that as a proxy for climate in many ways. And you can see in 1990 compared to 2006, everywhere is a lot warmer in 2006. So anything that lives in a, let's say you had a vector-borne illness that started here, but it couldn't spread into the green zone. Well, because of global warming, it can now spread from northern Texas all the way up into Oklahoma, into areas where it wasn't able to spread prior. Here's an example, mosquito, the Asian tiger mosquito, which can lead to Triple E and West Nile virus. Currently, its range is in red. But if we look at a predicted range based on climate data, considering that as CO2 increases, the temperature will increase and the mosquito's range will increase following, it will spread to the green by 2020, the purple by 2050, and the yellow by 2080. So the range of this mosquito is going to expand drastically. And that's if we see moderate increases in CO2. If we don't do anything and we see much higher increases in CO2, the range expansion is going to even be worse. So that's something to keep in mind when thinking about human health and disease, is that climate change can actually exacerbate these issues. There's a lot we can do to deal with outbreaks, though. We can treat the disease. Hopefully we can eradicate it, we can contain it, and we can deal with the vectors, the bats, the mosquitoes, the birds. Treating the disease is generally will make it less deadly and make it less contagious. It's just about treating the symptoms, not a cure. It just helps deal with things like reducing nausea, headache, cough, etc., fever. Unfortunately, if you don't have great access to healthcare, if we don't have a lot of research done, there's going to be difficulty treating the disease. And much like with HIV, if there's a social stigma, people who have the disease may be reluctant to come forward and get treatment. You can also provide vaccinations. These will cure the disease and prevent people from getting the disease. And if enough people have the vaccine, the population will experience a phenomenon known as herd immunity, which means that fewer people can be infected, less likely that people will spread the disease from person to person, which is great for some people who are immunocompromised and maybe can't take vaccines. It allows them to be protected from the disease without actually having to take the disease. Basically, the idea is if enough people are vaccinated, the chance that someone who isn't vaccinated getting the disease is way, way, way lower. The chance that two blue dots will bump into one each other is much, much lower. Unfortunately, we've seen some challenges with vaccinations. There's some conspiracy theories that vaccines cause autisms, but that's not based on any real science. And unfortunately, the anti-vaccine movement has led to resurges in diseases that have long been thought to have been eradicated, including mumps and measles. There was a big measles outbreak that started in Disneyland a couple of years ago and spread throughout the Western United States and Mexico. The best thing we can do is eradicate a disease, totally wipe it out, get rid of it, like polio. But this is only possible if there isn't a reservoir of that disease. And a reservoir is just a place in the environment where the disease will linger around. So, for example, in Ebola, Ebola is naturally found and carried by bats. So unless you go around and eradicate all the bat populations in Africa, you're not going to be able to eradicate the disease. And that would be impossible to do. And the last thing you can do is control the vectors. If you can't control the disease itself, you can at least control the organisms that spread it. So spray for mosquitoes, use tick treatments on your dogs, avoid exotic animals and animals that can spread zoonotic diseases. These will help limit spread. Wear bug spray, you know what I mean? It's simple, but it can really get the job done. Anyway, that's all I've got for you. If you've got questions,